I think we'll get started. In light of the fact that we only have one of our three panelists. But I asked Herb to extend his remarks to give us extra time. So.
Oh.
The topic of today's discussion is going to be just how relevant is the Muslim Brotherhood today. In June of 2012, President Muhammad Morsi was elected president. He was the chairman of the Muslim Brotherhood's Freedom and Justice Party. In July of 2013, he was removed from office. And a project that I've been working on and the London Center has been working on is focusing on the Muslim Brotherhood from various different aspects. But as I travel on the hill and off the hill, a common theme or a common question that I receive is, well, now that Morsi is no longer in office and in Egypt, just how relevant is the Muslim Brotherhood? Which is a very important discussion, a very important question, one that actually concerns me because whether you are a member of the House or Senate that thinks that the Muslim Brotherhood is a moderating force, or you're one of somebody who thinks that the Muslim Brotherhood is not a moderating force, which are probably more than the former. The question still arises, and it's something that's very disconcerting that people are unaware of how relevant the Brotherhood is. So I put together a panel discussion today, and I know that due to a personal emergency that Olin Professor may not be able to join us today. But I put together a panel discussion to discuss the relevance of the Brotherhood, but focusing on various different parts of the world. I want to focus on the United States and Israel. I would like to focus on Europe, and I would also like to focus on Egypt. Now that let's start beginning with Egypt, we now know that the biggest question is just how relevant is the Muslim Brotherhood there now that Muhammad Morsi is not in office. But even more so, why do we care? Why should we care? Other than Egypt, why should we care about the Muslim Brotherhood? So therefore, I asked Herb London and Olin Professor again, who's not here, and Bud McFarland to speak on those areas of the globe and why and how they are how the Brotherhood is relevant. I think we'll begin with the London Center's President Herb London to talk about the Brotherhood and their relevance, and then we'll ask Bud McFarland to discuss the Brotherhood's relevance in Egypt in particular, as Mr. McFarland headed a delegation just recently to Egypt and to meet with the leaders there. Herb?
Well, first, let me thank you very much for joining us today. There are a couple of people I should introduce. My dear friend John Molstetter just walked in, who's on our board. There are so many others in this room who I know. My dear friend Josh London is with us today. So thank you all for being here. It's a great pleasure. It's always an honor to be in the company of Bud McFarland, who I regard as one of the great heroes of the Reagan administration, someone that I greatly admire. So I consider myself to be privileged to be part of this panel. But thank you very much for being here today. Let me say a few background comments about the Muslim Brotherhood before I get into some detail. According to the founder, Al Palmer, and I'm quoting him, I'll try not to editorialize, but to try to give you some factual basis for the comments I'm about to make about the Brotherhood. He said, "It is the nature of Islam to dominate, not to be dominated, to impose its laws on all nations, and to extend its power to the entire planet. Therefore, the Muslim Brotherhood opposes secular tendencies of Islamic nations and wants to return to the precepts of the Quran. The Brotherhood firmly rejects all notions of Western influences, in addition to rejecting extreme Sufism. Brotherhood members organize events from prayer meetings to sports clubs for socializing and proselytizing. The motto, as many of you know, Allah is our objective, the Prophet is our leader, Quran is our law, Jihad is our way, dying in the way of Allah is our highest hope. So that death takes on a very different meaning in this Muslim Brotherhood. And the Brotherhood, as you probably know, emerged from the Wahhabist movement. Organized in 1928, when it was first put together, it was emerging from a 200-year tradition associated with Wahhabism. An important aspect of the Muslim Brotherhood ideology is the sanctioning of jihad. In 2004, Awadari, who, as you know, is the leader of the Muslim Brotherhood, made it a religious obligation of Muslims to abduct and kill U.S. citizens. Obama wrote before that the Islamic flag must be raised again in territories once ruled by Islam all over the globe. That includes Spain, Sicily, the Balkans, the Italian coast, the Mediterranean, Muslim territories near the Mediterranean. The Brotherhood is also viewed by many in the Middle East and the West as the root source for Islamic terrorism. In 2003, a former Kuwaiti Minister of Education, Dr. al-Rabi, wrote, and again I quote, "The beginnings of all of the religious terrorism that we are witnessing today were in the Muslim Brotherhood's ideology. All those who worked with bin Laden and al-Qaeda went out under the mandate of the Muslim Brotherhood. Indeed, the Muslim Brotherhood not only condemned the United States for killing bin Laden in May 2011, they also facilitated the growth of al-Qaeda. They also, if you look at the leadership, including Zawahiri and even Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, they came directly from the Brotherhood in either Syria or in Jordan. The Brotherhood's founder, Obama, was a devout admirer of Adolf Hitler and the Nazi regime. Some of you know that. During the 1930s, the Brotherhood became more political in nature and an official political group in 1939. Over the years, the organization developed an apparatus through which to provide military training to its followers and to create political tensions wherever it existed. In 1973, the Israeli government allowed local leader Ahmad Yassin to run social, religious, and welfare institutions among Palestinian Muslims. In 1983, he was arrested for illegal possession of firearms and attempts to kill various Jews. He was sentenced to prison. When he was released in 1985, he became more popular than ever. When the first Intifada began in 1987, he became one of the founders of Hamas. Though the Muslim Brotherhood is now viewed by some in the United States, including our own State Department, as a more moderate group than other Islamic organizations operating in the Middle East, such as al-Qaeda, there is no question about the linkage between the Muslim Brotherhood and al-Qaeda. In September of 2010, Muhammad Badi gave a sermon in which he said, again, one of the leaders of al-Qaeda, "The improvement and change that the Muslim nation seeks can only be attained through jihad and sacrifice, and by raising a jihadi generation that pursues death just as our enemies pursue life." In an effort to possibly hide their militancy, they have changed in the 2011 organizational laws, changed the English language into Arabic in order to deceive and make it clear that jihad is not on the agenda. The Brotherhood has branches in 70 countries and territories, including its main contingencies in Egypt, Syria, Gaza, Libya, Tunisia, and Jordan. It maintains active branches in the United Kingdom, France, and numerous other European countries, including the United States. The point that I want to make about this, however, is that in the Holy Land Foundation trial, we learned a good deal about the Muslim Brotherhood in the United States. In that trial in 2008, which was extremely valuable in pointing out the many ways that the Muslim Brotherhood has access to institutions in the United States, it was pointed out by Zaid al-Noman, one of the Muslim Brotherhood leaders. He provided a very detailed history and description of the Muslim Brotherhood in the United States, including front groups like the MSA, Muslim Student Association, talking about the bylaws, which had to be expanded methodically in order to increase the reach of the Muslim Brotherhood in academia, government, intelligence, law agencies, the media, military, and society. The tactics have been well explained by many others. And what I've attempted to do is just define what are the tactics of the Muslim Brotherhood as seen in all of the literature. Again, I'm not editorializing. These are words that emerge from the Muslim Brotherhood itself. First, avoiding open alliances with known terrorist organizations and individuals to maintain the appearance of moderation. Infiltrating and taking over existing Muslim organizations to realign them towards the Muslim Brotherhood's collective goals. 3, using deception to mash the intended goals of Islamic actions as long as it doesn't conflict with Sharia. Establishing financial networks to fund the work of conversion of the West, including support of full-time administrators and workers. Putting into place a watchdog system for monitoring Western media to warn Muslims of international plots fomented against Muslims, what's sometimes referred to as Islamophobia. Cultivating an Islamist intellectual community, including the establishment of think tanks and advocacy groups, and publishing academic studies to legitimize Islamist positions and to chronicle the history of Islamic movements. Building extensive social networks of schools, hospitals, charitable organizations dedicated to Islamist ideals so that contact with the movement for Muslims in the West is constant. Involving ideologically committed Muslims in democratically elected institutions on all levels in the West, including government, NGOs, private organizations, and labor unions. Instrumentally using Western institutions until they can be converted and put into the service of Islam. Instituting alliances with Western progressive institutions that share similar goals. Inflaming violence and keeping Muslims living in the West in a jihad frame of mind. These are all quotations. Supporting jihad movements across the Muslim world through preaching, propaganda, personnel, funding, and technical and operational support. Instigating a constant campaign to incite hatred by Muslims against Jews and rejecting any discussion of conciliation or coexistence with them. Collecting sufficient funds to indefinitely perpetuate and support jihad around the world. Now these are all troubling, but they come right from the Muslim Brotherhood playbook. As I indicated before, I am not engaged in editorializing. Now what is so interesting about this is that several years ago, I went to a Council of Foreign Relations meeting. And it was a meeting that was organized by Hillary Clinton. And it was a charm campaign for members of the Muslim Brotherhood. And she opened her remarks by saying that what we have here are basically very moderate people. And indeed, the 5 people who were present on the stage at the Council of Foreign Relations came right out of Central Casting. They were as attractive as any people I've ever seen. Each one of them could have appeared in a Hollywood film. The woman who was there was really quite beautiful. I thought it was a young Hedy Lamarr. And she was wearing a scarf around her head. It was a Prada scarf. It was magnificent. And each one of them was introduced individually, and one would say, I have a PhD from Oxford. Next one, I have a PhD from Cambridge, and on and on. When asked the question, how do you feel about the Copts in Egypt? They said, oh, we want to work with the Copts. Our goal is not to dominate the society, but to integrate the society. Their words, not mine. This charm campaign went on not only in the Council of Foreign Relations in New York, but in Los Angeles and across the country. And it was indeed a charm campaign. The State Department belief is that the Muslim Brotherhood could be a stabilizing force in North Africa. The tactics are right out of the old Soviet disinformation playbook. And it is a very, very dangerous game in my judgment. And so what we have here is a story to tell. A story not only about the Muslim Brotherhood penetrating institutions in the United States, but the Muslim Brotherhood now becoming a force across the globe for a variety of reasons, including creating the distinct impression that's a moderate organization. We have people on both sides of the aisle in this country who will tell you we can deal with the Muslim Brotherhood. They're basically moderate. And I'm saying on both sides of the aisle in this government in the United States. So it's clear that our government has already been penetrated. So the question is, what do we do next? The answers obviously are not clear. We have a problem. And the problem is, how do we as Americans mobilize ourselves to deal with this issue? On the one hand, we sacrifice blood and treasure to fight the war against Al-Qaeda. On the other hand, we have people in our own Congress who are saying to us, the Muslim Brotherhood, which may be the brains and the financial instrument for Al-Qaeda, is moderate. How do you keep these two positions together? Last, I'll just remind you of a story. I always tell stories. It's a story that took place at West Point, where an instructor has a group of young cadets, and he's saying to them, we've got a problem here. There's a tank brigade on this hill. We have to determine how we're going to take it out. He asked people in the class, what would you do under these circumstances? Finally, a young man says, I've got the answer. I'm going to call in the F-16s. They got the tanks. The captain who's conducting the class says, where did you get the F-16s? And the young cadet looks at him and says, the same place you got the tanks. And so this is the problem that we're facing. We deal with ambiguities. We deal with abstractions. But we very often do not have a precise strategy and formula to deal with the problem. I want to hear from you. So this is really introductory. But thank you very much for your attendance.
Thank you, Herb. I want to ask Bud McFarland to come first.
Thanks very much, Ollie. Thanks to each of you for coming today. I want to thank Herb London for his opening remarks, which establish a compelling intellectual framework for the principles, the driving animus that guides the Muslim Brotherhood. It's been around since 1928, and as Herb explained, it was founded upon the principles of Wahhabism that go back to the mid-18th century. Basically, a doctrine that denies the legitimacy of any other form of worship, indeed, any other interpretation of Islam than their own very extreme view, which is, as Dr. London explained, to exterminate, to destroy, to eliminate infidels wherever they may be. That violent jihad is the obligation of every good Muslim, and that there is no modus vivendi with any alternative faith unless the individual converts to their particular kind of Islam. Founded in 1928, they have come by electoral process. Power going on 2 years ago in Egypt, and in the electoral process thereafter elected as the first president of the Muslim Brotherhood, Muhammad Morsi. Recall for you what that one-year experience involved in Egypt. It hadn't been long after being elected that Morsi began by appointing, not electing, governors in the several provinces of Egypt, and of those, 7 of the 17 civilian governors were members of the Muslim Brotherhood. Through those governors in the provinces and in 5 more military officers who were members of the Muslim Brotherhood, he dominated and had direct channels of influence in 22 out of 27 provinces of Egypt, with Muslim Brotherhood governors in place. In the next 10 months' time, he went through a process to Islamize the society of Egypt, and Egypt is indeed an extremely devout, practicing Muslim country, not committed or organically obligated to the Muslim Brotherhood, but indeed vulnerable and susceptible to the seduction of the doctrine of the Muslim Brotherhood. However, in terms of actually producing results were all in the wrong direction in that one-year experience under Morsi's leadership. Egypt began soon to experience severe food shortages. In less than a year's time, the unemployment rate rose to 25%. Today in Egypt, half of the population lives in poverty. Investment dried up as a consequence of sensible investors understanding the risk and how it had risen dramatically. The tourism industry, in which the majority of those employed actually are involved, understandably dried up out of not only violence that was evident, but through countries, including our own, imposing travel bans that dried up the principal source of revenue throughout the country. In addition, the Sinai Peninsula, which had been a relatively benign area of Egypt, on the east bank of the canal, became a haven for Al-Qaeda affiliates from throughout the Middle East, and became a very, very active center of training, as well as violent attacks against Egyptians. And it is today a leading center for the growth of radical Islam in the Middle East, through coming there for training, arming, tactics, and deployment back to home countries throughout the Middle East and South Asia. In addition, Morsi fired, sacked many of the general officers in the army and put in place officers that had been sympathetic to the Muslim Brotherhood. He seized full control by edict, not constitutional authority or new law, but by edict, full executive powers to act as he chose, in addition to take on the responsibility of the legislature and to, through cronyism, to corrupt the Egyptian judicial process. All in all, establishing a very firm totalitarian control over the Egyptian society. The doctrine of the Muslim Brotherhood has been well explained by Dr. London a moment ago. There are fundamental principles that are essential in a matter of obligation for each member of the Brotherhood. They have a very high premium on long-time member loyalty, and those who have been most loyal are promoted to more senior levels. They seek to place themselves in civil service so as to be able to channel resources to Muslim Brotherhood projects. The majority, at one point or another, serve time and are incarcerated for various criminal activities. Indeed, it is a badge of honor. It has become, and one has to acknowledge, is the flagship of extremism throughout the Muslim world. The tutor, the doctrinal foundation, and the motivating influence throughout the Middle East and South Asia. I want to come back to a point that Dr. London stressed, which we in the West tend to underplay. The right of deception that it is in their interpretation of Islam, okay, indeed encouraged to deceive, to lie, to be able to look you in the eye with a straight face and say that what you had thought was black was actually white. And I don't mean to be facetious here. For people to come to important platforms like the Council on Foreign Relations, and to stand there and to say things that simply aren't true, is reminiscent of something we'd experienced before in the 1930s in Germany, where an ambitious immoral leader sought to undermine what had been a strong, largely Catholic body politic in Germany, and seduce them through a pattern of lies, promises, and outright blasphemies against ethnic minorities in Germany at the time, in order to establish control, undermine institutions, develop a controlling totalitarian authority, rearm, and then take on the expansion of that National Socialism throughout Europe and targets ultimately well beyond. This society is of a piece with that same methodology that denies the legitimacy of any other faith, that is not only intolerant of alternative interpretations of Catholicism, Protestantism, Jewry, or even Islam, and holds as a fundamental obligation the duty to wage holy war, violent jihad, on every infidel, and every infidel includes every person that doesn't subscribe to their interpretation of Islam. This is an organization that is extremely well financed, originally by Saudi Arabia, and to this day, notwithstanding prescriptions against it, by wealthy Saudi so-called charities. It's a form of protectionism. But make no mistake, it enables an organization with extremely good finances to go abroad, and including in our country, and to subvert our institutions, to exploit them, for sure, and our laws, to guarantee or to secure protection under the law for subversive activities that portray Islam as a benign faith without any aggressive purposes, even while they change the curriculum in our schools, urge the adoption of Sharia law, and wage court case after court case against governments, state governments, that try to restrict their activities. This works, and it can work here. Our country has a long tradition of tolerance and of believing in freedom of religion, indeed defending the right of people to worship as they please. It's a very healthy bedrock principle of our history. And we don't anticipate or believe that there could be any subversion, undermining, or assertion that an alternative, violent faith that denies everyone else's right to worship as they please could truly exist. It can. And through our tolerance, and well-meaning willingness to remain quiet, to see this as a transient phenomenon, is to deny that the exact same tactics practiced in Nazi Germany in the 1930s led to the horrific, devastating losses we suffered in that conflict. This is something we simply have to become better grounded in. We must study, and we must take action to require that our public officials, our teachers, are not misled by the well-meaning attitude of tolerance into allowing the transgression and ultimately the subversion of our very rule of law. Think hard about this. Develop yourself, not through my own rhetoric or that of others, facts. They're not hard to find. Go and Google Muhammad Morsi. Muhammad Morsi is the gentleman who is currently the supreme guide, is his title, for the Muslim Brotherhood. In our country, the press and academic life has asserted that the Muslim Brotherhood has evolved to become a benign, actually social services provider. Listen to Muhammad Morsi. He says that holy war is our obligation, that violent jihad is our duty, that killing infidels, and that includes every not member of the Muslim Brotherhood, is our obligation, that the peace process between Israel and the Palestinians is a delusion. Well, when the leader of an organization tells you that without apology, and when challenged today in public press conferences, doesn't retrench, if it sounds like a terrorist, looks like a terrorist, talks like a terrorist, Thank you.
I'm going to open up to questions, but and Ari will be walking around with the microphone. I ask that all questions appear in the form of a question and not a statement or speech. But I'm going to begin with a question, one for Herb, one for Mr. McFarland, that is, and it's both the same question. Assuming the United States, and assuming we don't look at the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization like so many other countries have classified them, what would be the consequences to Israel and allies like Israel? And then again, what would be the consequences to what I'll call potential allies to Egypt? Herb, any other questions?
I think you can hear me even if I don't use the microphone. My own feeling about it is that the peace treaty with Israel, which lasted for roughly 35 years under Mubarak, was extraordinary. I'm not here, by the way, to sanction or impress you with what Mubarak stands for, because I thought it was very necessary to have him removed. However, one of the first acts of Morsi was to say he would abrogate the peace treaty with Israel. As Ms. McFarland has pointed out, I think very eloquently, what we have seen in the Sinai, it is not only well armed, but is an area that has become a source of terrorist activities all through the region. The request on the part of the Egyptian government for 6 Apaches designed in large part to deal with the terrorist threat. Apaches that, by the way, have not been sent despite the promise. In large part because this administration continues to assert that this is the El-Sisi government, or about to be the El-Sisi government, is not a legitimate government. And they came to power illegitimately. So that is the contention, that is the argument that's made by this administration. The larger question is, how does a tolerant society deal with intolerance? Now, I'm reminded of a quote by George Santayana, it's kind of in my memory bank, and it's always there, and I always think about it in relationship to the Muslim Brotherhood. Santayana said, the first and overarching duty of a tolerant man is to be intolerant to intolerance. That is, you cannot sustain tolerance if you ignore intolerance. And so we have an obligation as both a people as well as defenders of our Constitution to stand against the intolerance that exists in this community. We may want to rationalize and come up with the concept that this is acceptable, but it is not acceptable. It's not acceptable from Israel's standpoint. It's not acceptable from the European standpoint, and it certainly should not be acceptable in the United States. So the first responsibility that we have is to tell the truth. What is the enemy? Who is the enemy? What are we facing? What are we confronting? And then the second thing is, we should use our schools and our institutions in a somewhat different way. That is, I believe in telling the truth in our schools. So tell the truth about what this country stands for and what our enemies stand for. Before this event began, I had a conversation with a couple of people in this room, and they started to talk about interfaith councils. Now, I'm always amused by this because I participated. Invariably, an interfaith council is a church or a synagogue that invites members of the Islamic faith to present their point of view. And we're supposed to understand and be sympathetic, and I'm all for it. But what I do not understand is why the reverse doesn't occur. Never occurs. Why isn't the laws of our land, the Constitution, and the way in which the Judeo-Christian traditions unfolded in America, why aren't they discussed in the mosque? That is, if it's interfaith, then it should go both ways. Never does. So it seems to me we have an obligation. The obligation is to tell the truth and defend our institutions. We know how to love freedom in America. Now we have to remember how to defend freedom. And it's that defense that I think is the ultimate challenge of this era, this generation, and our people today.
I had the good fortune to go to Egypt in December and spend a week there talking to the transition leadership there. And I came away very impressed with the talent, the intellect, and the plan for moving beyond the Morsi government toward a more sustainable future. I'll tell you what I mean by that. I met with a gentleman named Amr Musa. You may recall that he had served before as foreign minister and beyond that as Secretary General of the Arab League of all of the Arab states in the Middle East. A moderate gentleman, a man of considerable vision, intellect. Well, he was put in charge of writing a new constitution that had been dismantled by the Morsi government. What impressed me was that he brought together 50 representatives. And I have to tell you, having tried to bring together 2 cabinet officers when I worked for President Reagan, the notion that I would have 50 that I had to bring together is out of the question. But he did it, and these included the poor. He invited the Muslim Brotherhood to decline, but then from the military, from the police, from cops, and all of them gathered over a period of several weeks between July and September to draft a constitution. And much to my surprise, his process included making their work available to the Egyptian people on television, and television is easily accessible by every Egyptian. Twice a week. Now here I ask myself, could any American leader today or ever undergo or lead a process in which whatever you were trying to establish, you said, well, here's where we are thus far, twice a week. Well, you would provoke such a backlash of perhaps well-meaning but chaotic criticism that you'd never get it done. But Amr Musa And this committee of 50, as it was called, over the course of about 6 weeks' time, had a draft. And it was amazing to me. On one day, he'd be on television saying, all right, well, today we've been treating women's rights. Well, actually, that's kind of a novel thing to do in a Muslim country. But then the next week, he would say, we were talking now about human rights, civil process, but in short, ending with a constitution that was approved in a referendum overwhelmingly. Overwhelmingly, not just among a small turnout, but against a giant turnout of hopeful Egyptians that things are going to get better here, and it has to be under the rule of law that provides for women's rights and other minorities, freedom of religion, and so forth. With regard to Islam, everyone was concerned about whether or not Sharia was going to be either adopted or at least the foundation set of principles. And this group of 50 had the courage and the wisdom, I think, to say, we will draw upon ideas in Sharia, but it is not the driving legal framework for our country. There's a lot of courage. And then the Constitution provided that life would go on and the politics of Egypt would begin to be respected through elections, a parliamentary election, a presidential election, and hopefully the return of investment and over time prosperity that would reduce the unemployment rate and so forth. It's important that our country, that all countries, look hard at these facts. The tendency in our press since that intervention by the military a year ago has been to say that it was a coup and that the same old story of the military's dominance of the Egyptian society is about to happen again. But you see virtually no coverage of this extraordinary process politically that they have been going through, or even entertains the idea that the violence that you are seeing is being launched by Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Qaeda affiliates, and emigre coming from all over the Middle East and South Asia to the Sinai Peninsula for training, weapons, and a sustained effort to bring down this government of Egypt. I don't expect that the new leadership of Egypt is going to cave under this pressure. Yes, it does have the guns, but it's going to be an extremely stormy period ahead. This really is where the Muslim Brotherhood, Al-Qaeda, and its affiliates from throughout the world are making a stand. And it is vital that our country acknowledge if their principles are right, if their respect for human rights are being observed, that it deserves our support, and that what they are coping with is a determined, violent, subversive organization that denies all of the principles on which our country was founded here. We have to expect from our leaders, federal, state, and local, the courage to be able to sustain a conversation and end up pointing out the Muslim Brotherhood hasn't changed a whit in its doctrine from the day it was founded in 1928. Violent jihad is its way, and that will be its way. And that we have a chance to turn that tide in Egypt. And if it happens in Egypt, the cultural capital of the Muslim world, from Morocco to Indonesia. This is the right place to make a stand.
One minor point, I want to get to your question, but one very minor point. It's very interesting to see the coverage that has occurred with a rural judge talking about the public execution of 529 former Morsi followers, and the fact that the Constitution of Egypt received almost no attention. In both the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, they derided the Constitution as nothing more but what Egypt has experienced in the past. This Constitution formally recognizes the rights of women, as McFarland has pointed out. It not only recognizes the rights of women, even though there are very few Jews, it recognizes the rights of Jews. It recognizes the rights of Christians. So in some respects, this is a remarkable document, considering the circumstances that surround the history of this brief episode. Now, I think that it's important to understand that, and unfortunately, members of our press do not. And I think that Brother McFarland stated this very eloquently and quite correctly. This is a stand that we have to take. Egypt is the place. It is the capital of the Muslim Brotherhood. It is a place where you have had many religious leaders standing behind the Brotherhood. Now is the time for people to stand up against it, as this military government is, and you will see the unfolding of a more democratic government as the days pass.
John? No, just please identify yourself before you...
John Rappaport. The mainstream media has essentially been promoting the narrative of the Muslim Brotherhood renouncing violence. So I wanted to ask a question. Are you finding that the mainstream media is simply complicit, or are the Egyptians not doing a good enough job of actually telling the story and sort of forcing it into the American press to validate the reality of the Muslim Brotherhood and what it meant to the Egyptian society?
Look, language is very important. I would not describe what happened in Egypt as a military coup. Once you call it a military coup, that has significant implications in the way in which the Congress thinks about it, and the way in which Americans think about it. It was a popular uprising. They didn't have a way to change leaders. They didn't have an impeachment process, didn't have recall. And so what you had is a popular uprising where 22 million, keep in mind, 22 million of the 90 million people in this population actually saying we want to see change. So if you think about it in that way, it was popular and in some sense represented the will of the people. But getting that message across in the United States is very difficult indeed, in large part because of the cynicism associated with a military government. And the fact that you had a military government in Egypt in the past, and they see this as another example of a military government that wants to crush the Brotherhood. And indeed, they should crush the Brotherhood, in my judgment.
Daniel Pollock with the Zionist Organization of America. I'm interested in the foreign policy establishment. You guys talked about how they really want to make it possible that the Muslim Brotherhood could play a constructive role for stability. Are they deluding themselves, or do they have an honest understanding of the Muslim Brotherhood that differs from the one that you have both enunciated? I'm asking whether they really are being honest with the American people when they say they think the Muslim Brotherhood can be productive.
Well, one can say that it's simply an expression of our tradition of tolerance. And that's a very healthy tradition. But especially in the intellectual community of our country, you do have an obligation to be accurate and balanced. You may acknowledge that there are a large majority of Muslims in the United States who have no evil intent, and that is a fact. But then to say there are many who don't, and concretely, here's what they are doing in city X, Y, and Z to undermine the school system. Here's what they're doing to undermine our court system in cases being brought that are, if not frivolous, without foundation. And here's what our Justice Department is doing to obfuscate truth regarding the purposes, the sources of funding, and declared objectives of this organization. So you've got to be able to sustain the conversation without being cowed by this overarching notion of tolerance. Of course, be tolerant, but be truthful and factual, and don't back away from this.
Let me just remind you of two things. I'll make it very brief. There was a fellow named Andropov who came out of the KGB. He led the Soviet Union, and our press covered nothing but his love of Dixieland. And said, yeah, he's one of us. He loves the music of the United States. And then I remember another very interesting example. George W. Bush told the story of a fire that occurred in one of the Dumas in the Black Sea that was owned by Mr. Putin. Mr. Putin had a cross that he kept there. And the firemen recovered the cross, brought it to Mr. Putin. And Bush said, I looked him in the eyes, and I could see that he was one of us. Well, we want to believe. We are very naive. We want to believe a lot of things, and we often associate the truth with what we would like to see happen. And that has been one of the extraordinary developments in American foreign policy. The things that we would like to see people believe are true. And that very rarely is the case. And I think of that Bush story because I have great admiration for George W. Bush. But I'll never forget that story. How he was so taken in by Putin. Yeah, he's really one of us. He so coveted that cross. I knew that he was one of us. Well, we've learned a lot.
John Wolstetter, Senior Fellow, London Center. Might we have an opportunity in light of Mr. Putin's, I'm going to relate to the Middle East, Mr. Putin's Sudetenland rationale for annexing part of Ukraine by going back to Egypt and pointing out that the real coup in Egypt was Morsi, who followed the precise model the Nazis followed in 1933, of making a coalition with radical parties and then creating a new constitution. And that the uprising was a counter coup, in form a coup, but supported by more people probably than have ever come out in public for any revolution anywhere. So might this not say, well, yeah, the Nazi playbook was the administration spotted very quickly here. They didn't do anything about it consequentially, but that's a different problem. And point out that it was precisely the Nazi playbook, to say nothing of going back in the 30s, their collaboration, that the Muslim Brotherhood followed.
John, I think it's a very good point. It's not coincidental, of course, that Morsi went to see Kawadawi in Pakistan, that he went to Iran and talked about Iran providing support for the terrorists in the Sinai. I mean, there is a lot that we know now about what Morsi was doing, and there'll be much more that's revealed when these documents become public. So it seems to me that you've got it exactly right. Yes, Wes.
Gentlemen, thank you. Wes Wessels, Oxford PhD, sorry. I go back a long time with Egypt. In 1983, about 31 years ago, I went to Easter Mass in Cairo. I dare say that would be very difficult to do today. And then I go forward 2 years later, being blown up in the Rome airport by unidentified terrorists, not firsthand understanding what a terrorist attack means, but simultaneously receiving from Hosni Mubarak a letter delivered to my hotel bed with a box of dates and fruits and candies and gems from him in his office, saying, "Come home to us, our brother." Radical thought is what we're going to talk about today, and it's typically rooted in poverty. It's typically not organic, as was mentioned earlier. I disagree with that completely. It's viral. It doesn't necessarily grow, but it's there. And in this particular case, without absence of options, it's compelling. So, we talked about constitutions. These are not constitutions, gentlemen and ladies. These are not at all constitutions. That's why they're called Islamic republics. Pakistan, Iran in particular. If you think that there's a constitution associated with Sharia or Islam or the Quran, you're wrong. It's not there. So, is it not, and this is the form of question, is it not our obligation to be educators and providing options? Remember, radical thought is easily fed when you're poor, when you're without options. This is true with drugs, this is true with an awful lot of things. Why do narcotrafficos in South America succeed? Because there's money and it feeds people like this. So absent any other options, what do you think our educational goals should be to inform and to enlighten? Because I can assure you that I know the everyday Egyptian probably better than most. I can assure you that radical thought is far from it. But as Mr. McFarland said, it is still there.
Wes, look, I thank you very much for your comments, and there's a lot that you just said that I agree with. My colleague David Golden has described Egypt as a banana republic without the bananas. So there's no question that this is a country that is impoverished. There are steps that have to be taken. The first is stability, because without stability, you will not have any economic development. In the past, 20 million people served in the tourist industry. There is no tourist industry today, so 20 million people lost their positions. So the first thing that you have to do is, if you want to have tourists come to the country, demonstrate that you can maintain stability. And look, I don't think of this new government as a group of Jeffersonians who have come to the stage. And so I don't want to overstate the case. But I do think that they are capable of establishing some sort of stability so that economic development is possible. The second thing is, the area around the Suez is a potential for great manufacturing development. It provides easy access to Europe, and it seems to me that it's an area that the Egyptian government wants to capitalize on. But again, I go back to the first principles. The first principle is maintain stability in the country so that you can engage in this kind of economic development. And I think that you're absolutely right. Poor people without options, who knows what they're thinking. They're inclined to be radical if, in fact, that kind of proselytizing occurs. But I think that you can change things in Egypt. And the first and overarching responsibility should be, let's see if we can stabilize the country. This kind of internal conflict that now exists between the Morsi followers and the government, as I indicated before, has to be crushed. I mean, I know I'm saying this in very blunt terms, but they have the Morsi followers, and they represent something on the order of 90,000 to 100,000 people, have to be defeated. And then I think you can move ahead and do other things in the country.
We have time for one more question. Tony,
Tony Bergen, those of you who don't know, is America's greatest actor.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Yes, we have a. My question is probably going to end up the same way it did in New York on last Wednesday, I believe it was, in the morning. But with a complacent government that we have in our country, supporting the Muslim Brotherhood, infiltrated in our country, as we know. It's a very dangerous thing, and the word tolerance is a very dangerous word. You don't have tolerance for people that are going to defeat you and want to kill you. So let's not have tolerance for those. I think we have to get active, more active than we are, of course. If the press will not carry the message, we're dead. It's over and out. Because if it's not happening on television, it's not happening. And to write about it as best we can, to broadcast it by whatever channels they will allow us to broadcast it on. You know, we have, it seems to be our only tools. Because, and the educators, they're already infiltrated our schools, training our young of all ages. So here we sit, 30-odd people in this room Don't bother counting, I already did. And I say 30 underlining, only 30, trying to get the message out. My question as I ended, was, what do we do? That's the question. What do we do? We've heard all the problems. We know all the problems in our country. We know what's happening. We see it. It's so obvious to everybody in this room of what is happening. So with the odds against us, with our Constitution vanishing, with the President of the United States lying and doing illegal things and not being prosecuted, what do we do against this?
That's a very compelling case. But I think if I could simply offer a street politics solution, is that you can't be something with nothing. This organization is powerful, well-funded, and we have to have leadership worthy of the name. And I'm not pessimistic. I look back to the late 1970s when the Soviet Union moved very aggressively throughout the world and established a dominant influence in Angola, Ethiopia, Mozambique, South Yemen, Afghanistan, Nicaragua, and there seemed to be a Soviet tide running in the world. And 5 years later, we were well on the way to bringing down Marxism into the Cold War and once more emerging as leader of a strong NATO and European alliance. So it can be done, but you've got to have somebody that's willing to stand up, run for office, suffer all the slings and arrows involved in this awful process we have here, and win and lead, but we can do it. We had...
One of the great mistakes I think we make in meetings of this kind, and I'm somewhat culpable, is that the mood is always lugubrious. We feel there's a real challenge that we face and we can't do anything about it. But one of the great mistakes, and I think Bud McFarland was getting to this, that we make is underestimating the resilience of the American people. We're still a very resilient people. I know we're well past the hour when we said we would close, but I just want to mention one story to you. It's a story a couple of you might have heard me tell before, but it's one that I think demonstrates a good deal about the way in which Americans deal with issues. During the 1920s, there was an attorney for the Capone gang named Fast Eddie. Everyone knew Fast Eddie because you've seen him in film. He was caricatured in film as a fellow who would find some technicality to get some criminal off. And he was very, very well known in Chicago. Every police officer, every attorney knew Fast Eddie, and he was well rewarded for his gifts as a legal scholar and a legal attorney. So well off was he that he had the largest estate in Chicago. And people from around the globe would very often come and say, look at that palace right in the middle of Chicago, Fast Eddie's home. One day, Fast Eddie left his palace and 16 bullets filled his body. The Capone gang didn't want one person to have this kind of authority and knowledge over their malfeasance. I go fast forward. I tell a story about a young man named Butch O'Hare. Butch O'Hare was a pilot in World War II. And Butch was on a mission, and he goes off in the Pacific, and he goes off with his team of flyers, and he looks at his oil gauge, and he realizes he doesn't have sufficient fuel to finish the mission. So he radios his captain. He said, I've got to get back. Captain says, please go. He leaves, so he's on his own. He's a lone ranger. He's flying through the skies to get back to the aircraft carrier, and he sees 6 Japanese Zeros. Takes out a machine gun, starts to fire, actually takes down one. runs into another, takes down the tail of a second, takes down the wing of the third, and he limps back to the aircraft carrier, barely making it. He becomes the most heavily honored naval officer during World War II. Butch O'Hare wins the Navy Cross, and when he was ultimately killed in the Mariana Islands later in the war, he receives the Congressional Medal of Honor. He was the most honored pilot that we had in the United States Navy. We named an airport after him in Chicago. The largest airport in this country is named after Butch O'Hare. And if you go to Terminal 2, it tells the story just as I've told you the story. All of the exploits of Butch O'Hare, what he did in the Pacific, flying that plane. But the one thing that is not mentioned in the big statue and on that plaque is that Butch O'Hare's father was Fats Eddie. In the United States, we go from one generation to the next, and it's thoroughly unpredictable. You don't know what's going to happen. But you know that in a free society, with the Constitution that we have, almost anything is possible. One of the great philosophers of the 20th century, I'm being facetious, Fat Swallow once said, "One never knows, do one." Thank you.
I want to thank everybody for London for the panel. I'm sorry that Waleed Faris wasn't able to join us today. I just want to leave you with two thoughts. Number one is that this is the first of many discussions that we're going to have on the Muslim Brotherhood, focusing on different aspects within the Brotherhood, so that way we get a clear understanding, and not just a 30,000-foot view. And the other is the last Thursday of every month, I host on Capitol Hill a defense meeting where we'll have about 11 presenters in about 60 minutes, all talking about issues that they are currently working on. And I see that some that join our meetings are here today. And I would like to encourage everybody to join us as well. With that, thank you very much.